Hi, this is John Nash of Hey Not the Face podcast, and today I have a special guest, Matthew Stoller, Matt Stoller, I believe he prefers to be known as, formerly of Open Markets, now the American Economic Liberties Project, I believe, author of a great book called Goliath: 100 Years, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. I could not remember the subtitle for that, even though I've read it when it came out. And also you have a Substack called Big. So you are the perfect guy to bring on, because one thing I've been talking about for well over a decade now is the potential of the UFC being a monopoly, an antitrust violation. You're one of the foremost uh, experts, or I guess proponents, of increasing antitrust enforcement in the United States. So you're the perfect guy to bring on and talk about the UFC antitrust case and monopoly. So I guess one thing I try to do is I try to dumb down the show for people like me, to make it a little more simple. So one thing I think would be great, could you explain to the listeners why antitrust is important, and also give us a definition of antitrust and monopoly? Because I think a lot of people get caught up on the Webster's definition of monopoly, where it's just one seller, or monopsony, one
Right,
buyer.
right. Yeah, so antitrust is a specific form of law, and it's not the only kind of law that does this, but it's the most important form of law that is supposed to prevent monopolization or other forms of business practices that consolidate power and control in the economy. So, and a monopoly is, you could say it's there's lots of ways to define it, but it's unified control of a recognized branch of trade, right? So it's about control, and often that manifests in pricing, power over price. You can raise prices, you can lower prices, just because you have, you can essentially dictate prices that people have to pay for stuff, or that you want to pay for stuff. But it isn't just prices. Sometimes it's about, you can determine what technology gets deployed in the industry, or you can set the terms for how people work, or for what products get sold through the distribution channel that you control, or maybe the rules that run that run the market that you're in. So and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's one entity. You could have a series of entities who kind of band together, formally or informally. That would be like a cartel that that try to exert forms of control. So that's what monopoly is, and antitrust is the body of law. And there's a bunch of different laws that involve things like mergers, or forms of business practices, like tying. So saying, in order, if you want to buy this one product from us that you need, you have to buy this other product from us that you don't need. A very common example of that would be like in the 30s or 40s, when movie studios would say, you really want to put Gone with the Wind in your movie theater, then you have to take at the same time this shitty movie that no one wants to see and put that in your movie theater as well. That would be an example of tying. But there are lots of other practices, like saying, hey, if you want to work for me, then I'm going to make you sign a contract that says if you quit, or if I fire you, you can't work for any rivals or potential rivals. That's called a non-compete agreement. There are mergers. I'm going to buy up my main rivals, and then I'll control the industry. There's a lot of stuff you can do, and the antitrust laws are designed to prevent those kinds of tactics.
That's actually a great setup, because a lot of it has to do with, I mean, one thing I like about mixed martial arts, the UFC, particularly in combat sports, is it's kind of, the UFC specifically is like a microcosm of the American economy. You have problems with
Yeah,
labor, you have problems with antitrust, you have problems with regulatory capture, and which antitrust, you have monopoly. When you have monopoly rents, which is people out there, when you make so much money, you can spend money anywhere. It's easy to capture regulatory bodies because you have extra money to throw at them and stuff.
right.
So it has all these aspects to it that I think cover that you when you look at the greater American economy, what we're having problems with, you can see it in a fishbowl with the
Yeah.
UFC. And so that's what I like about it. So I guess to get into it, one is what happened to antitrust in some ways. I want to go off on a segue, but what happened to antitrust, that because I think maybe we should explain the consumer welfare model just briefly, because in a weird way, all we seem to be concerned about in the last few decades, which has led to this growth of these monopolies, is that consumers are hurt. And it's
Right.
we kind of ignore all but like in the UFC case, the fighters and the other promotions, the other people that may be hurt.
Right. So I think that to put your question in a slightly different way, I would say if we have these laws that are supposed to deal with corporate power, then why are corporations so powerful? Like what happened? Is that a good way to put it?
A much better way. Look at that. Looks like you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah. So the answer in short is that we stopped enforcing these laws, right, in the late 1970s and early 80s. And there's lots of fancy ways to talk about that. But, that's essentially what happened. We're just like, and we didn't change the laws. The Congress didn't repeal them. It's just that the judges and you ever want to know who controls American politics? It's judges. But like the judges in the government under Reagan and then later under Clinton were like, antitrust, that's old school. Like that's not modern enough. In the modern economy, everything is super competitive. And like you don't want the government to like get involved in the marketplace, right? Like that's like, how does the government know? Like that was sort of the attitude. And they used this technique, which you brought up, this language called the consumer welfare standard, which is a really misleading term. But basically what they said is like prior to the 1980s, it was kind of like, you played the board game Monopoly. If you own all the properties of one color, you got the monopoly in that area. And the way you would know that there's a monopoly prior to the 1980s is like the board game Monopoly. Like, do you own do you control all the companies of one color, or or in one industry, right? If there's competition, it means there's a bunch of rivals buying or selling. That would be the way you would define it. And it's about like, is there a concentration of power in the industry? What happened in the 70s and 80s is a bunch of people said, oh, that's totally the wrong way to understand what competition means. Competition just means our price is low. Is there efficiency in that market? So we don't care if there's 1,000 retail stores, each of which is controlled by a family who lives in a town, or if there's one store, we'll call it Walmart. As long as prices are low, that's fine. So the old way of saying, we have 5, 6, 7 companies in an industry, let's make sure they don't merge, that's foolish. Let's just make sure that if they do merge, that like they maximize efficiency and prices stay low. And so what happens if that's your way of thinking? Well, Walmart's slogan, everyday low prices, is really built around that theory. And Amazon and Google and Facebook, sometimes, Google and Facebook, some of their products don't even charge a price. Facebook, you can log on for free. Google search is free as to the user ostensibly, not free to the back end to the companies that need to ride the rails, but it's free to the consumer. And Amazon sells cheap stuff. Walmart sells cheap stuff, ostensibly. And so antitrust law in this new interpretation where you say all we care is about maximizing efficiency, not to say that they did maximize efficiency, but that's what the claim was, kind of doesn't apply to these kinds of corporations. And so what's happened over the last 40, 50 years is you've seen the growth of a massive set of very powerful institutions that have monopolized industries everywhere. So concentration is a systemic feature of the American economy. And you see it really clearly in UFC, right? And mixed martial arts. And you can compare mixed martial arts to boxing, right? Which is a completely different market structure, and they operate very differently. The compensation structures are differently. The sports are fairly similar, but the laws around them are very different. And it's because boxing, the legal framework was actually put into place through the Muhammad Ali Act, I think in 2000, which actually broke apart the industry. Whereas mixed martial arts follows this kind of consumer welfare framework of antitrust law that was really designed in the late 70s and early 80s that has facilitated huge amounts of consolidation.
I'd love to get back to the Ali Act, because one thing I think is fascinating about it is it's really an anti-monopoly bill. And it's, if you
Yeah,
know, we get back,
definitely.
and we'll get back to that in a second, because I find that fascinating. It seems to be something missed by a lot of people. It came out the original form of it came out in 1960, I believe it is, in the antitrust committee hearings about boxing, and then
I
that
didn't know
bill
that.
continued. Yeah, Estakoffer, I can't remember the senator's pronunciation
Yeah,
of his
no,
name.
it's power. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's the one that came up with it, and he passed away, died. But that bill, that lingering bill, took decades, but that was where it started. So, but I'm going to get into that because I find that a fascinating subject. But to get back to the UFC, I guess an example I'll give to listeners is, I mean, one thing is like Google, it's for free, but our websites make very little in ad revenue because Google and Facebook take that ad revenue. But that doesn't damage the consumer. That
Right.
damages the other entities. The UFC case would be like, we're not damaging the fans because we're giving all the fighters, but the people that are being hurt are the fighters whose wages are being suppressed much lower than they would normally be. And so the damage is the consumers not being hurt in this case, but other entities are being hurt. And that's the consumer welfare, I
Right.
guess, is the mistake.
And I'm guessing that prices for mixed martial arts are actually higher to consumers than they would
Yeah.
otherwise be, because the consumer welfare standard is a bullshit term. But what they would argue is, well, what consumers want is the UFC product, right? They don't necessarily care that much about who the fighters are. They want the UFC product. Therefore, that's what we're delivering them. And maybe you could deliver these fights cheaper somewhere else, but that's not what people want. People want the brand, right? So that's how they would probably contest your point, which is of
Although
course absurd.
you do a simple test, but no one will ever do the simple test, is let the big Francis Ngannou and John Jones go fight somewhere else and see how they do. And
Right. I mean,
but you never see them say, oh, because we're the brand, we're going to make our contracts much more less coercive, much less restrictive. No, they make them
no,
more
I mean,
restrictive.
the antitrust is so stupid because it's like not the law, but the way the debate is like, just like, oh, you use common sense. I mean, you don't even need to. You have a natural experiment. You have boxing, right? You don't need. And you also had mixed martial arts before the consolidation, so like you don't need to uh to see, like, you have plenty of natural experiments. It's like Ticketmaster, when everyone knows that Ticketmaster is terrible, right? I mean, it's like you don't need to have lots of information and data about it. Like, just use your common sense, right? And that's but like we don't do that because they're like, oh, you have to measure output effects, and they open up the door to all this like
We
stupid
need to make
legal.
regressions to prove it, and it's like, well,
Right,
it's
right,
pretty
right.
obvious,
Well,
just but
I mean,
yeah,
how do you
but
know that consumers don't want the UFC brand, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
oh, well, I have to do a natural. It's like so much fucking busy work.
But well, again,
Anyway,
I could just get back to, if it was, the brand was so important, they would not make their contracts almost perpetual. So that's or worse and worse every time. Anyways, but now that they brought up I guess the antitrust lawsuit. I'm imagine you've been following the UFC antitrust lawsuit.
yeah,
The
yeah,
the
somewhat.
question, why the hell is it taking so long to get a class cert 4 years after the judge said he's going to grant a class cert? What's going on with, I guess, the law, because it seems to me like almost a justice issue that the plaintiffs, if they have damage coming to them, they have to wait. They could end up waiting a decade to get any sort of relief. And these are guys with broken bodies and CTE.
Right, right. I mean, it's so first of all, the judges are terrible. Like, that's just for starters. Like, just judges should be ruling on this stuff within like 6 months, and it should just be done, right? It's just like ridiculous. One of the biggest antitrust cases of all time was the Microsoft case in 98. It was filed in 98. It was heard in 98. It was ruled on in 98. It took 6 months to a year. I mean, there was investigation going on before that, but like, it should not take this long. And the UFC case isn't the only one. I mean, the Google case, one of the Google cases the investigation started in 2018. It got filed in 2020. It's still not even at the trial stage, right? And this is the government. This isn't a class cert issue. So it's like, now that particular judge is, I think, afraid of certifying a class because, I don't like to get partisan in these things because I'm like, but in this case,
You get a lot of crap
generally
already for not being partisan. So we'll leave the.
yeah, well, but in this case, it's like the Republican judges are very hostile to the ability of people to certify into classes so that they can sue. There's a famous, the famous case of like the McDonald's coffee, like where the person, that the basically like big business gathered together in the like the 80s and 90s and said, we don't like that people can sue us. So they attacked the idea of being able to certify into classes and said, oh, it's all those greedy trial lawyers. And like, yeah, trial lawyers are often greedy, but like it's, you know, that's like a check on corporate power. But they've like dramatically weakened the ability to certify into classes through all sorts of various like legal tricks. And uh, and the net result is that this judge, who I think does want to certify them into a class, is first of all overloaded, but also is like afraid of being overturned on appeal. And so that's why that's why this stuff takes forever. But like ultimately what we need is for Congress to just step in and start to legislate again, and to start legislating in lots of different areas, and just say it should be much easier to certify classes, and also just to say like judges have to hear this stuff quickly and rule quickly, yay or nay. And like ultimately when we have a you know, the strategy of the of the I think this is really Mitch McConnell's strategy, but like the sort of old school Republican establishment, there's some newer Republicans who are different, but the old school Republican establishment was, let's not let Congress legislate on anything, and then we will move judges who agree with us on policy into the judiciary, and they will shape the law. And because Congress can't pass new laws to override their interpretations, the law will gradually be moved into a place that we like, and that will shape the kind of society that we like. And it's basically been a successful strategy, but the net effect is one of the things they don't like is people being able to certify in classes and sue monopolists, like, you know, like mixed martial arts.
Yeah, so it's
So
all,
there we go.
basically the strategy, my understanding, is like a wide-reaching Lochner court stretching down instead of just the Supreme Court, going around through all the different appeals
I
courts,
mean,
all the federal courts.
that's one way to put it. Lochner would be a case.
Mhm.
It was a case in like the early 1900s. That said that the New York State could not regulate the hours of bakers, and it was basically striking down the ability to do social social rulemaking, minimum wages, those kinds of things. Well, I won't quibble on the history. Let's just say that the courts now are probably more friendly to corporate power than they've ever been.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Well, I guess we go in the point that, in many ways, though, I guess a lot of the stuff has been that the FTC has dropped the ball for decades. I would argue,
That's
and
true. It
the new
has.
FTC I'm very happy with. Although there, people in the pro business people probably hate the new FTC, but
They do. Not pro
but
business, but pro monopoly. A lot of business people like it, but it's like difference between a
yeah.
monopolist and a business person. Like
Well,
every fighter, right?
yeah, well, I mean, that's in a weird way. Many, people look at the fighters like a labor issue, but in many ways, fighters is like a small business issue. Fighters are independent contractors; they're each their own business. So, it's like, it's like small businesses dealing with like all the different websites dealing with Google, small traders dealing with Amazon. UFC is the platform that dictates the price to these guys, and so small
Right.
businesses you could look at it being squeezed. It could be a
That's
small.
right.
It's a free market issue, I
Yeah,
guess. So
they all have brands. They all have like, yeah, I mean, they're business people, right? It's just
yeah.
that when we think about business, you know, usually we think of you know, people would look at UFC and they would say that's a business, and then they look at a fighter and be like, that's not a business. But like, of course, you know, the person who's fighting and maybe has, you know, other people that work for them as agents or
Yeah.
whatever, like, of course they have a profit and loss um, impulse,
Mhm.
and they have to take care of themselves. They have like things they need to do. They have opportunities. They act in their own business interests. UFC is not really a business. UFC is a has a business within it, but it is largely a political institution that is trying to maintain its monopoly, and trying to shape the law to preserve its monopoly. It's less a business than the fighters themselves. So
Yeah.
that's the way I would, you
Well,
know,
yeah,
look at it.
one way UFC looks like a business when it's the only entity, because you look at it like, oh, that's the only place to work. But if there was multiple competition, fighters were moving around, then it would be more obvious, like in boxing, that the fighter is an individual business himself,
Right.
going to promoter to
That's
promoter.
right. I mean, UFC should be a business, but it's not. It's a monopoly. It needs to
Yeah.
be like,
Well, that
you
gets
know,
us back to comparison to boxing and the Ali Act. And I guess I think one thing is confusing, and for a lot of fans, and this is just my point of view, is that the people look at the antitrust of the monopoly power that the UFC has, And it's not just that they hold events, it's because it's centered, I think, because it's sport. Sport's slightly different. When you control the titles, there was a case in boxing, the International Boxing Club of New York was ruled a monopoly in the 50s. And one of the ways they had a monopoly was if they had the champion under a long-term exclusive contract, and then they had the top contenders. And so if you ever wanted to be the champion, and they showed in that case that being the champion is more valuable than not being the champion, it makes you much more valuable, you had to sign with them. And so there's this input, this barrier of being valuable in MMA is that you have to find success, and the only way you really blow up to be a big star usually is becoming a champion or beating a guy that's very well known. And if you deny access to that, if you make people sign exclusive contracts to get that, that gives you control over the sport.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, it's because what you have there is it's not just a monopoly story, it's also a story of conflicts of interest, right? Because what you had there is that this New York institution, they were both the promoter of the fight and profiting from that, but they were also doing the ranking of the fighters. So they had in like through the controlling who could become the championship and the champion. And that is a conflict of interest because clearly, the promoters have an interest in becoming champion, but then if you can control who the champion is or who gets to face the champion, then you can manipulate and organize like promoting, right? And it's the same thing. I see the same thing in a different sport, which is cheerleading, where the cheerleaders they have a monopoly too, which is called Varsity Brands, and they have that same dynamic where the company that controls who gets to cheer in the world championships of cheerleading also like sells all the equipment and and controls all of the contests and has control of. So it's that it's that conflict of interest that is also a core problem. We see conflicts of interest kind of across the economy. There are also prohibitions against conflicts of interest across the economy. Like if you're a doctor, you're not allowed to take money to prescribe someone a certain medication. That would be like a conflict of interest. You have to split those two things out. Or we've had these kind of structural prohibitions in the economy, all banking and commerce, right? There's always been a separation between those. And so like the idea of conflicts of interest is well understood. And what you see in boxing is you don't have that conflict of interest because of the Muhammad Ali Act. And you do have it with UFC. You had it in the 1950s. I might be butchering some terms here or there.
Yeah.
But that's kind of my.
Well, yeah. I mean, boxing. One thing is boxing is repeatedly talked about the way it's constantly monopolized, and then finally the Muhammad Ali Act seems to put an end to that. The threat, because one thing it does, it prevents restricted coercive contracts. You can't tell a guy that the only way you're going to get this title fight that you're declared a mandatory is signing with us. And also, there's it possibly, which it hasn't been shown, enforced in court, but it does seem to make the argument that a promoter cannot control a title, can't have their own titles. And so when you separate the titles and then you cannot dictate who fights for that title, it prevents the monopolization of divisions, as they were saying in the hearing. So that's
Right.
the key.
And the boxers just get paid a lot more. The net effect is boxers
get
paid a lot more.
Yeah. Well, I think fans would argue, this is the weird, a lot of fans would argue like the lower tier UFC make more than boxing. But one thing I always got to remind people is that that's because all the top fighters are in the UFC. The boxing promotions, there's like the UFC has 40 events a year. Amongst the top boxing promoters, it could be anywhere from 120 to 160 events. So yes, the lower guys in the prelims might not make as much, but the top 3, 4, 5 guys are making more. Well, that's still more boxers overall making more on average. And the top guys that are actually driving the sales, they're getting they're getting their MRP, their marginal revenue product out of it. They're taking the share that they're actually driving the sales. With UFC, the promoter gets to keep that. So but yeah, no, it's pretty clear. It's interesting too, is the UFC actually follows the pro wrestling model, because in pro wrestling, the antitrust and FTC and stuff was investigating the National Wrestling Alliance at the same time they're investigating boxing, the International Boxing Club, and they kind of let them get a pass because one of the reasons supposedly is because they told them, hey, we're fake. And because we're a fake sport, we're like, well, it's kind of, what's the point in enforcing it? Who gets to be the champ? That kind of monopoly that they have. And so pro wrestling, always the promoter got to control the title. And so MMA promotions has followed the pro wrestling model, where boxing, you're basically compelled to use an outside body as the sanctioning organization.
Right.
So
That's really interesting.
little bizarre history there.
Oh, I mean,
But
one of the cool things about antitrust is, I'm a generalist, but every industry is different, right? I mean, there are commonalities, but the details of every industry are, you get to learn so much about it. So it's really interesting to listen to you.
oh, well,
Yeah.
like one of the few people ever said it's interesting to listen to me. I'm impressed by that. Going on the Ollie Act. So there's been some efforts to get it through Congress. It doesn't seem to have made much leeway. I guess one problem is there doesn't seem to be much fan or even fighter support for the Ollie Act being passed. So I guess what are the odds of something like that getting passed through Congress when you have this entity that has tons of money, can lobby, versus little guys trying to do it, and there doesn't seem to be much grassroots support for it?
Well, if the fighters don't want it, then it's not going to happen, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if they want it, then it could happen. Like it seems like a fairly obvious that it would be a good, or that it would restructure the sport in a probably in a healthy way. But ultimately, Congress is responsive to like what the public wants, and
Mm.
if the people involved in the industry like are not into it, then it's not going to happen.
Well, I guess one of the
Uh,
problems too is that there seems to be a lot of fighters behind the scenes that would support it. But the idea of coming out publicly with the UFC there, with the way they control the sport, is what it's, everybody's
I
afraid to be
see.
the
So
person to step forward.
there's a fear of retaliation. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, one thing that would probably be helpful would be an antitrust suit from the government. I mean, that's one of the things that you see everywhere is just this fear of retaliation in every industry. So I don't know how to do that, but people got to figure it out. They got to figure out like how do they? I mean, maybe retired fighters can talk or something like that. But what you see, the app developers are terrified of Apple, and medical providers are terrified of of United Health Group, and you can go on down the line. There's just like third party sellers are terrified of Amazon. Like you just have immense concentrated power everywhere, and yet people come out and they do talk, and they are you know you do see that happening. And I think with the UFC, the antitrust case is pretty important. So that would be, and I think the DOJ has started filing amicus briefs, although I don't remember on behalf of the fighters. But that just makes the case more important.
Well, yeah, although the previous DOG under Trump, the antitrust division, I can't remember the fellow's name, but I believe there was some fear that he
Felony,
was, yeah, there was some fear that since he used to lobby for Zuffa and other companies, there was some fear that he was going to file briefs on behalf of the defendants.
yeah, he probably would have, but he just didn't get around to it.
So well, that goes,
Um,
I guess, how important then, I guess, is it's strange that our antitrust policies on the FTC and DOJ I mean, there's the mass difference between Tim Wu and Lena Khan and Cantor between previous administrations is pretty vast. So is it strange that it changes that rapidly, administration to administration, and how can you have a consistent enforcement if every administration is so wildly different?
just bringing them up, one thing that fighters could do is they could actually go to the antitrust division
Mhm.
and privately complain, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of companies that do actually talk to
Mhm.
the government secretly, and
Yeah.
that's definitely something people can do if they want to.
Yeah.
And their names will not they won't be retaliated against.
Mm.
So that's one thing. But we've had basically a consensus in antitrust going back to the early 1980s, when you had like a pretty radical change to ratchet back enforcement. And that was kind of, it was first, it was a Republican thing under Reagan and then H.W. Bush, but then Clinton's people essentially accepted it and ratified it. So you've basically seen a kind of continuity in antitrust enforcement from the Reagan era all the way up through the Obama era, and most of the Trump era. There was one or two things that Trump did differently, but what Biden did is he did make a fundamental break from that, and he appointed people whose track record was in critiquing that form of lax enforcement and saying we need to be much more assertive and bring back the pre-1980 model. And they have done that. And it's been pretty, like, there's been a lot of aggressive frustration from big business about this new regulatory framework, and the abandoned mergers, lawsuits against Google and various agricultural giants. So Amazon, like there's a new way to do antitrust. And I think you do have to wrestle with you do want some continuity in enforcement, but you also want to be able to change if enforcement isn't delivering on the premise of the law. And I think that we weren't delivering on the premise of the law. So it did require this kind of change. And hopefully the next administration, whoever it is, will continue this kind of more assertive way of doing antitrust.
Well, I really like too a lot of the little stuff they look at, like the non-competes and the potentially like the Department of Labor, the NLRB, looking at the idea that independent contractors should also be allowed to organize, and which is because I mean another aspect we get is like unions is in a weird way they're not the weakening of unions. Unions offset monopoly power because a labor union has monopoly power of its own, and our weakening unions have let business run rampant in many ways. So
That's
I
right.
do like that. I mean, and one thing I got to say about Biden, I'm surprised because I was not a big Biden fan, did not back him, but President Biden is done doing a lot of the damage Senator Biden did, and I'm very happy to see that. So that's
Well, he's doing something. It's a very mixed administration, but much better than I thought it would be.
yeah. Well, on
Um,
certain aspects, the NLRB, FTC, those departments. I don't want to get into everything else, but
yeah, no,
it's those are key. But Trump was interesting because he seemed to have some sense of antitrust, but at the same time, I mean, like with the UFC, it seemed like him and his administration were willing to go out of their way for their buddies.
well,
So
that's the thing about Trump is that there was a kind of chaotic element to it. There were a lot of things that he did that were, I think, really positive in terms of reorienting political economy, but there were so many places where he did the opposite, and it was very random. And often it was who talked to him last,
yeah,
or is he friends with this guy or that guy? And so that was like it
it felt a
was
lot of it felt personal. Like Jeff Bezos, Amazon. I don't like him. Let's go after them. You know,
right. I mean, and you could say, well, what he did on or almost did on UFC would have been personal because it was just been like, oh, that's my buddy, right? And in a sense, everything is always personal in it. But yeah, it didn't seem like Trump had a particularly clear policy. It was just sort of like there was a little bit of we think we should be doing this slash, oh, I want to give a favor to that guy slash, oh, I want to punish that guy. And it wasn't, he didn't have a way of thinking about what the economy should look like.
okay. We talked a little about boxing, how it's obvious as an example, the B model that boxing offers pays so much more. But one of the big fears expressed by people is they don't like the boxing model, fans and stuff. So I guess is there from a point of view, if you were trying to, let's say, advise the fighters or people trying to navigate the system to get something better, would you focus on the antitrust lawsuits? Would you try to get the Ali Act passed? Would you think we'd have to amend the Ali Act? Would you is there other things people haven't thought maybe about that maybe
Well, I
you've
don't,
thought of
I
that
mean,
you've seen in other industries?
I haven't thought it. I don't know.
Mm,
This sports is an area that I think is really interesting. And I just don't have a sense of how to do it. It does feel there's a little bit like there might be a situation where you could say we want to have like limited no consolidation at the top and no conflicts of interest at the top, so the promoters and the people that control championships cannot collude, um, and the fighters get to negotiate, but at the same time maybe there's something where you have some sort of like quasi cooperative structure among fighters so that there's there are like maybe minimum salaries or something, like so that essentially to like create more like if a boxer gets $100 million payday, make sure some of that goes to the boxers that are just kind of on the edge.
yeah.
I don't know how you do that, but like
Well,
you basically don't want a winner take all dynamic.
I have a
um
solution for that, but I'll say that for no,
I mean that's the thing.
I think the simplest thing, it's not simple, but if the fighters create an association as independent contractors and you pass the Ali Act, well, the government never enforces the Ali Act, but an association has standing. They can enforce it themselves. And they basically do the next step, the PGA, and create, instead of having outside sanctioning organizations, there's no rule that says an association can't create their own sanctioning organization. Then you start writing bylaws that say, oh, the sanctioning fees are going to go to like pensions and stuff to help other fighters.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I think that the key is to have the fighters and the alumni in the like having a
Yeah.
conversation about what the industry should look like, because ultimately, like, this is not a question. Yeah, as somebody who thinks about this, like, I can give, I can be like, all right, here's some thoughts, here are some analogies, but like, this is not this is not something that experts need to come up with. This is something that, like, it's a political decision, and the fighters should figure out what they want the industry to look like, and then map that out legally, and then advocate for that.
No, okay. Well,
Right.
that seems like a good ending point, before we open up too many cans of
Sounds
worms.
good.
So
Thanks,
I thank
John.
you,
This was
sir. That was very enjoyable. I'm happy to finally meet you, sir. I'm a big fan of your work.
likewise, likewise. All right, talk to you
Yeah.
later.
So I want to once again thank our guest, Matt Stoller, author of the book Goliath, which I highly recommend. Also, highly recommend his Substack, Big, which does a great job of giving us real world examples of antitrust and monopoly. If you enjoyed that interview and you want me to do more interviews in the future, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you on the next Hey Not the Face podcast.